Okay.
My name is Bruce Clark, and my background has been in law and international business, and most recently as an educator at La Salle University here in Oaxaca. In other words, in my own small way, I have served in the past as an agent of that neoliberal project popularly known as globalization and the Western intellectual tradition as it has been formalized in our institution of higher learning. But today I come to you not as an agent, executive, or educator, but in all humility as an interpreter and translator of an immemorially ancient tradition of an indigenous people, the Ayuk or Mihe of the northern mountains of the state of Oaxaca. That tradition is called Wejën Kajën, which might be translated as awakening through practice. It is probably presumptuous of me even to attempt to translate this tradition into the discursive language of the Western intellectual tradition, as I am far from fluent in its highly sophisticated theory of human development through several dimensions: biological, psychological, intellectual, social, and spiritual. But I have attempted to familiarize myself with the underlying concepts through the work of Shadab Vargas Vasquez, professor of mathematics at Nova Universitas in Ocotlan. I have done so because I believe the work of Shadab represents the first, or at least one of the first, serious autonomous efforts in preserving indigenous cultural tradition in the face of the threat of extinction posed by this project of globalization to which I've already alluded. The project involves an aggressive cultural homogenization which threatens the spiritual genocide of the indigenous peoples of the world. And it is only through the efforts of these very indigenous peoples, abetted by people of conscience everywhere, which can forestall this grim destiny. It is altogether fitting that this project launched by Professor Vargas Vasquez should be launched here in Oaxaca through the foundation of the Indigenous Research Institute International, as Oaxaca is the site of one of the most egregious episodes of cultural genocide ever perpetrated in history during what might be called the first wave of globalization during the period of discovery and conquest of the Americas by the European powers. Although it might be an overstatement to call myself even a dilettante in the subject of Mesoamerican archaeology, some of the more recent New World archaeological findings seem to indicate that the calendar of the ancient Mesoamerican people, popularly known as the Mayan calendar, may have originated here in Oaxaca with the Zapotec civilization, which reached its zenith in the last centuries before the Christian era. The calendar itself survived the destruction wrought by the conquistadors and the zeal of the early Catholic missionaries who followed in their wake. However, the intellectual apparatus which underlay its creation is lost to us forever. Just what does that really mean? The Gregorian calendar commonly in use today was not calculated until the very end of the 16th century, and despite the marked advance it represented on the Julian calendar promulgated upon the order of Julius Caesar in the year 45 BC, a century or more after the Zapotecs appear to have formulated the basis of the so-called Mayan calendar, it still did not obtain the accuracy of the Mesoamerican calendar that had already been in use for over 1,500 years in the area of Oaxaca in Mexico and elsewhere in Mexico. The Mesoamerican calendar was even more accurate than the Gregorian, to within seconds of the true solar year. The true solar year was only calculated in the late 18th century with any great degree of greater accuracy by Laplace and Lagrange, with the help of the Newtonian celestial mechanics based on the differential and integral calculus discovered by Newton and the great rationalist philosopher Gottfried Leibniz in the 17th century. In other words, although we have the Mesoamerican calendar as proof, we have lost forever, it would appear, barring an archaeological miracle, a powerful system of mathematical calculation every bit as sophisticated as the greatest mathematical discoveries of the 17th century, which had been developed here in Oaxaca 2,000 years earlier. And the ruins of Monte Alban demonstrate a geometrical tradition of just as high an order as anything accomplished in the West or elsewhere in the world. Who knows now what further mathematical, scientific, and architectural discoveries and development could have been achieved had the world had access to that extinct tradition. Cultural diversity is clearly as vital to a sane and healthy world as the ecologists tell us biological diversity is. This has been recognized by the Declaration of Indigenous Rights adopted by the United Nations Organization in 2007. This is an instrument full of fine and high-vaulting words, but fine words alone will not accomplish the noble objective set out in that document. It is the efforts of the indigenous peoples alone which can accomplish the goal set out therein. Unless those efforts are supported and facilitated, those words must ring hollow. Article 14 of the Declaration of Indigenous Rights reads, 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions, providing education in their own languages in a manner appropriate to their cultural methods of teaching and learning. Subsection 3 states, states shall in conjunction with indigenous people take effective measures in order for indigenous individuals, particularly children, including those living outside their community, to have access, when possible, to an education in their own culture and provided in their own language. As appears from the foregoing, international law has recognized the critical role played by education in the transmission and preservation of native cultures. Too often in the past, education has been weaponized precisely to repress and coercively subsume indigenous people into the dominant culture of the various nation states which they inhabit in an attempt to extirpate indigenous traditions deemed inferior, primitive, and even savage. Educational institutions foisted upon indigenous people, even in the fairly recent past and in the most technologically advanced societies, have been specifically designed and implemented for the purpose. The system of Indian boarding schools in the United States, for instance, based on the Carlisle Indian Industrial School model, which has persisted, though much modified of late, into the 21st century, is only one example of an aggressive program of cultural extirpation disguised as beneficence aimed at the world's indigenous people by the modern nation-state. The recognition accorded to this existential threat to the survival of indigenous cultures by the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, adopted by the United Nations Organization in 2007, was long overdue, to the point that today the great diversity of the world's indigenous cultures is greatly imperiled and many are on the verge of extinction. Fine words alone, even in an official measure of international law, will prove of no avail unless they are accompanied by action adequate to address the complex problem involved. In fact, enlisting the very institutions of the state that have in the past been the instigators of the project of cultural genocide would appear as paradoxical as it is counterproductive. Nor should the matter of the preservation of indigenous cultural traditions be entrusted to an academic laboratory of universalizing norms derived from such disciplines as social psychology, anthropology, and sociology, which are artifacts of the nation-state's dominant culture. Social science in general treats those traditions not as the living, autonomous, creative forces which they are, but as biological specimens to be denatured, dissected, anatomized, and analyzed. As Article 14 of the Declaration emphasizes, the educational systems and institutions constructed to preserve indigenous tradition should and must be established by the world's native peoples themselves. It is imperative, therefore, that the states comprising the international community provide the indigenous peoples subjected in the past to their project of cultural genocide the material support and political space for the development of those very educational institutions and systems from within a wholly indigenous framework. Wejën Kajën is the immemorial living tradition of the Ayuk people of Oaxaca State in Mexico. Not so much an analytical philosophy in the Western sense, Wejën Kajën represents a holistic approach to understanding the human condition and its development in its cultural, social, biological, and spiritual dimensions. It embodies and expresses the Ayuk people's core cultural value and forms the basis of their own political and social institutions, and is the organizing principle of work, exchange, and cultural transmission among the Ayuk. It defines for the Ayuk what human reality is in the course of its organic development in society and nature. Unlike Western philosophy, Wejën Kajën lays no claim to universal validity. It is the complex response of the Ayuk people to specific environmental and historical challenges. It is, in fact, the essence of the highly specific Ayuk cultural identity. There are, of course, similarities between Wejën Kajën and other indigenous traditions in that tribal organization tends to foster collective values and land tenure and social institutions that often seem to be at odds with the prevailing norms of the dominant Western tradition. In its role as the substratum of a living, dynamic indigenous culture, Wejën Kajën can serve as a model or template for the preservation of indigenous identity in a broader sense. Within the context of such Western cultural artifacts, such as sociology, anthropology, and educational theory, indigenous traditions are seen through a distorting lens as mere anachronistic objects of study, almost as archaeological remains. They are deemed somehow inadequate and inefficacious, if not harmful and stultifying, under the withering, all-seeing, omniscient gaze of reason, reified and raised to a quasi-mystical status of primary historical agency. As the Ayuk and other native peoples of the world recognize, the Western myth of reason represents an existential threat to their unique cultural identities. To accept reason's universal pretension would indeed be a death sentence for indigenous cultures in their manifold diversity. Yet Wejën Kajën does not seek to exclude all contemporary cultural, scientific, and technical influences. The Ayuk do not seek to seal themselves off hermetically from contemporary intellectual currents, but to modulate and channel these through their own tribal institutions and cultural structures to ensure the preservation of their own cultural identity. The Ayuk's Wejën Kajën tradition does not partition education off from other collective community activities, nor does it close the teaching process off within a hermetically sealed, specialized space. The subject matter to be taught members of the Ayuk community is not extracted from the social context of the community and reduced to abstract terms and putatively universalized norms. In the Western tradition, teaching and learning are almost invariably viewed as specialized activities to be conducted ideally within near monastic separation from the rest of the community within their own purpose-built precincts, such as a school, academy, or university, thereby reflecting the origins of the educational institutions of the West in an ecclesiastical matrix. Such institutions at least present the appearance of a near total isolation of the educational process from the mundane realities of the ordinary economy and workplace. Indeed, the educational process is shaped by Western institutions, often feigns a sublime indifference to such concerns. Academia proverbially purports to be an ivory tower elevated far above the base concerns of the workaday world in near Olympian detachment. However specious this pretense, the Academy works hard to avoid the appearance of sullying its hands with anything resembling the community's most vital concerns in pursuit of an elusive and illusory goal of intellectual detachment and objectivity. The classroom is supposed to be an immaculately conceived space within which the teacher is regarded as the sole effective agent, inscribing the matter of learning upon the blank slate, or tabula rasa, of the tender minds of the students, arrayed beneath him as passive recipients in the lowest ranks of the academic hierarchy. The students are viewed as empty vessels awaiting fulfillment from the fountainhead of omniscience in this ritualized but structurally unequal exchange. This concept of what the learning process comprises is based on various fundamentally unexamined premises of philosophical empiricism, which have long since been discredited by such disciplines as neuroscience. Wejën Kajën rejects the Western model that has become so ideologically dominant through the spread of neoliberal socio-economic institutions that it is taken for granted that such an environment as the classroom and this hierarchical relationship between the instructor and the instructed, to whom all learning must be infused, is of a unique and exclusive efficacy. To the Ayuk and other indigenous peoples, nothing could be further from the truth. The learning process, according to Wejën Kajën, cannot and must not be separated from the life of the community at large. Indigenous peoples generally regard the learning process as a lifelong transgenerational process in which all community members participate as a single collectivity, with each member playing a role appropriate to the stage of development each such participant is reached. Nor is there any dedicated space set apart in which such instruction occurs. The very concept of teaching as a highly specialized activity to be instructed to experts is alien to Wejën Kajën. Learning instead is viewed as a tequio, a collective effort by the entire community in which all participate according to their capacity. The humano pueblo draws on his or her own experience and innate capacity, developing over a lifetime, to apply him or herself to the various learning projects the community as a whole deems important for its survival and development. The Ayuk do not regard cloistral separation or specialization as at all essential to learning. Both its aims and methodology are subject to the community's collective decision-making. In other words, learning would not be conducted under Wejën Kajën in a closed, specialized space sealed against the community at large and directed by designated experts, with those engaged in learning regarded as mere passive vessels to be filled by preordained and pre-digested subject matter. The term Kajën indeed signifies a learning by doing. The community as a collective whole formulates the problem under consideration by the body of learners, which in fact encompasses the community as a whole in their various roles and according to their various capacities. There is never a hard and fast, bright line distinction between those who learn and those who teach. Each member of the community is at least potentially both a learner and a teacher. Each member is a participant in his or her capacity appropriate to the stage of development he or she has reached in life. The tradition of Wejën Kajën clearly delineates these progressive stages of development in a manner similar to, though very much distinct from, those set out, for instance, by Erik Erikson in his Childhood in Society. Wejën Kajën, however, not only takes into account an individual's phylogenetic development, but also his or her social and spiritual development in a multidimensional schema, whereas Erikson's neo-Freudian model, as well as Jean Piaget's educational theories, merely regard the humano pueblo as a purely biological entity. Wejën Kajën does not reject the idea that humano pueblo is indeed very much a part of the natural order, but insists this concept is stultifying if his or her social and spiritual development is excluded from consideration. The community defines the concrete subject matter of the problematic subjected to Kajen, that is, learning by doing, in terms of its most vital everyday concerns and highly specific projects directed to various environmental, technical, social, and political challenges encountered by the community. This is a form of culturally specific pragmatics, and the community as a collective is engaged in defining its own praxis. Shadab Vargas Vasquez will be able to identify and elucidate specific examples as to how such problematics may be formulated by the community in accordance with its traditions. In other words, curriculum design pursuant to Wejën Kajën is not to be entrusted to a hieratic caste of specialists, but will always be subjected to the community's collective decision-making. Teachers as such are not to be considered as members of a closed guild enjoying mystical and monopolistic omniscience and technical expertise, but rather as guides or facilitators who employ the skills and knowledge appropriate to their life experience to assist others in the dynamic process of learning by doing and community problem solving. Each member of the community can also assist the process according to their respective capacity, although many might not be as actively and continuously involved and may come into and go from the open learning space as dictated by the other various roles they play within the community. The learners would not be organized so much into classes, but into various cooperative teams who will exert themselves in the community problem solving to the extent to which their stage of development renders them capable. The collective learning process may be envisioned geometrically as an ascending helix tapering to a conical shape, as each cycle of learning by doing with subsequent reflection and self-criticism by the community narrows toward the solution deemed adequate by the community as a whole. For the term Wejen signifies the process of reflection at the close of each cycle of problem-solving effort, leading at last to the awakening or solution desired by the community. The involvement of the entire community in the process of collective problem solving, by which Wejën Kajën conceives as dynamic learning by doing, can address many of the problems encountered by Indigenous people in statist educational institutions, such as excessively high dropout rate and underperformance on standardized statist testing. The community will provide a setting consistent with its own cultural tradition, which will be more conducive to learning and which will entail the responsibility of the collective for the learning success of its members and can establish standards of measurement of success which will be more consistent with the community's own social norms and which will therefore be far more conducive to cultural preservation than the straitjacket of existing statist institutions and methodologies. By this means, a much more relevant scheme of education can be devised to further the cultural values of the Indigenous people, such as the Ayuk. A system of education can similarly be devised for other Indigenous cultures consistent with the ideals set forth in the Declaration of Rights of the Indigenous people and the destructive process through which neoliberalism has wrought on destruction on the Indigenous peoples of the world can therefore be arrested. Thank you.